The Kambing's charts died at 0347 ship time. Deka had been watching them thin for 3 days. The notation markers, little angular stamps that the Kambing placed at intervals, the way a surveyor might plant flags across a continent, had been growing sparser since they crossed the avoidance boundary Pakla identified back in the open space crossing. For the first 2 days past the line, there were still markers. Old ones, degraded data stamps whose formatting didn't match the current Combine standard, their edge characters warranted noise by however many centuries of database migration. Ghost flags. Someone had been out here once and planted their little angular stamps and then stopped coming back. Now there was nothing. Deka sat at the sensor console on the Arveth bridge, a console she had rebuilt twice in the past 6 days, peeling off interface panels to reroute display logic until the readout showed her what she actually needed instead of what a Combine freight operator was supposed to see, and watched the last notation marker drift off the trailing edge of the nav display. Behind it, data. Ahead of it, blank. The distinction mattered. Blank was not empty. She had worked with blank maps before. In the field outside Mogadishu, her NGO team had operated from satellite imagery that simply stopped at certain district borders. The imagery provider had decided not to look. The ground was still there. The people were still there. The map just chose not to see them. The Combine blink charted this because they had nothing to put here, she thought, watching the empty display scroll forward into uncharted space. I have been in places that got blank charted because people decided not to know what was in them. Those two blank spaces feel different. This one feels like the second kind. The bridge was quiet. Quintus's watch rotation had settled into a rhythm over the past week that Deka still found mildly miraculous. A Roman centurion organizing schedules for a crew that included a Norse raider, a Mexica warrior, a Comanche scout, a Romani healer, a Sengoku-era infiltrator, 3 aliens who communicated on channels humans couldn't fully perceive, an alien captain who had traded his cooperation for the dignified title of operational consultant, and 600 souls in the holds who were still learning that the locks on their doors didn't engage anymore. The rotation worked. That was the thing about Quintus. He didn't need to understand a person to deploy them correctly. He just needed to see what they were good at. Deka was good at this. The watching, the recording, the refusing to look away. She pulled up the sensor log she'd been building since they crossed the boundary and checked her methodology. Raw instrument feeds on the left to display her manual annotations on a flat panel she'd detached from a secondary console and propped against the wall beside her station, its surface covered in stylus marks, a combination of Somali shorthand, English abbreviations, and the 30-odd Kambe notation symbols she'd memorized from the freight database. The Combine's instruments were designed to categorize things. They were very good at categorizing things the Combine had already seen. They were useless for this. She was staring at the blank chart when the first anomaly appeared. It arrived without announcement. The Combine systems had very specific protocols for unknown contacts, escalating alert hierarchies, color-coded threat displays, automated flagging to the command console. None of that activated. Instead, the long-range passive array returned a reading that just sat there. Deka saw it in the background noise of the sensor sweep, a density variation at the outer edge of detection range, about 11 hours ahead at current speed. The instruments measured it, dutifully logged it, and then did nothing with it. No classification, no threat flag, no alert, because the reading didn't match any Combine category. She leaned in. The density profile was wrong, and wrong in a way she could distinguish from sensor noise or instrument degradation. She'd become intimate with both over the past 2 weeks and could read their textures the way Pakla read wind. This was a clean reading. The instruments were functioning perfectly. They were just returning data that the Combine's classification system had no bucket for. The density variation implied something there. Something occupying space. But the displacement profile, The way it interacted with the ambient particle medium around it didn't read like matter. Matter pushed things out of the way. This was more like a presence that coexisted with the space it was in without shouldering anything aside. Deka pulled up a blank annotation field on her propped panel and wrote the first entry, 0351, Anomaly 1, Designation Presence. Instrument profile implies something occupying space without displacing it the way matter should. Clean read, not noise. No combine classification match. Distance 11.2 hours at current heading. She was about to start a second pass when the density profile shifted, a fractional change in orientation, as though whatever was out there had adjusted its angle very slightly. She checked the Arvith's heading. No change. She checked the sensor sweep timing. The shift in the anomaly had occurred precisely 1.7 seconds after the Arvith's passive array had swept across its position. It had moved when they looked at it. Deka felt something she hadn't felt since the first time she'd opened the synthesis matrix and found 41 dormant parameters waiting to be unlocked. Curiosity with adrenaline in it. The pleasure of encountering a system she didn't understand and knowing she was about to start understanding it. She wrote the second entry, 0354, Anomaly 2, Designation Attention, same density profile as presence but with responsive orientation shift, timed 1.7 seconds after sensor sweep contact. It moved when we moved. Implication awareness of our approach. Intent unclear. I am naming things, she thought, and smiled despite the circumstances. I call this one presence because the instrument profile implies something occupying space without displacing it the way matter should. I call this one attention because it moved when we moved. I am making up a science in real time, and it is the most interesting thing I have done in 2 weeks. Over the next 40 minutes, 3 more anomalies appeared. Presence-type readings at different ranges and vectors, distributed in a loose pattern around the Arvith's projected heading. And she wrote this down too, hating the analogy even as she recognized its accuracy. Sentinels standing at intervals along a road, watching a traveler approach. None of them flagged any Combine alert protocol. None of them matched any Combine database entry. All of them adjusted their orientation within 2 seconds of the Arvith's passive array sweeping across them. The space ahead was inhabited. Whatever lived here did not exist in the Combine's categories. And it was watching. The first course correction happened at 0512. Deka almost missed it. She had been cross-referencing her attention readings against the Arvith's navigation log, looking for patterns in the intervals between the anomalies when the heading indicator twitched. A tiny shift, the kind of micro-adjustment the autopilot made routinely to compensate for particle density variations or gravitational drift. She wouldn't have noticed it at all, except that she'd stripped the autopilot's destination parameters 3 days ago. The autopilot didn't have a destination. She had never given it one. Hakla had set the heading manually, a compass bearing into the blank, aimed at the heart of the avoided cluster based on the old Combine markers that went in and never came out. The autopilot was maintaining that heading, not navigating toward a point. There was no point to navigate toward, and yet the heading had shifted by 0.3 degrees starboard. The autopilot log recorded the adjustment as a standard drift correction, but there was no drift to correct. The particle density ahead was uniform. The gravitational field was stable. The Arvith had no reason to adjust, and no one had told it to. Deka sat very still, staring at the correction in the navigation log. Then she pulled up the internal systems diagnostic and started running through the autopilot's decision tree. The correction was clean, properly formatted, logged with a valid timestamp and a standard correction code. It looked exactly like a routine adjustment. It was not a routine adjustment. She flagged it in her annotation log and kept watching. The second correction came 41 minutes later. Another 0.3 degrees, same direction, same formatting, same standard code, same absence of any actual drift that needed correcting. Deka watched it happen this time. She saw the heading indicator move. She saw the autopilot log the adjustment. She saw the correction code populate the record as if the system had simply done what systems do. She put her hand on the manual override. Her fingers rested on the cool composite surface, a slightly different texture than earth plastic, more like ceramic with give in it, and she held them there while the seconds stretched. If she engaged the override, she could reject the correction. Lock the heading. Restore Pakla's original bearing. The 0.6 degree difference between Pakla's heading and the corrected one was negligible in absolute terms. At this distance from the cluster's center, it changed their approach vector by a margin that would matter only if there was something specific to approach. If there was a door and the corrections were aiming them at it, or it was a system malfunction and she was reading intention into noise because she was exhausted and jumping at shadows, she did not engage the override. She took her hand away, placed it in her lap, and wrote 0553. Course correction 2. Heading adjusted 0.6 degrees cumulative starboard from Pakla's original bearing. No drift to correct. No destination in autopilot. The ship is being steered by something that is not me and is not the autopilot's programming. Corrections are gentle, gradual, like someone leading a horse by walking in front of it rather than pulling the reins. The third correction came 93 minutes later. She was ready for it. She watched every system on her rebuilt console as it happened. This time she saw something she'd missed before. The correction initiated from the communications array, not the navigation system. A signal came in too faint and too brief for the standard comms log to flag, and the autopilot responded to it as if it were a navigational beacon. The Arvith systems were acknowledging a signal she hadn't authorized them to acknowledge. Whatever was out there was talking to the ship in the ship's own language, and the ship was listening. Deka got up from her console. She found Quintus on the command deck, which was what they'd started calling the raised platform at the back of the bridge where the captain's operational station sat. Quintus was not sitting at the station. He was standing beside it, arms crossed, watching the main display with the same expression he brought to everything, calm assessment with iron underneath. The overhead fixtures cast their sodium orange light across his face, catching the line of his jaw, the close-cropped hair that was growing out unevenly because alien grooming tools didn't work the way Roman ones did, and the dull gleam of the iron service ring he still wore. The ship just corrected our heading by 0.3 degrees, Deka said. I didn't do it. Pakla didn't do it. The autopilot doesn't have a destination to aim for. I never gave it one. Quintus didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had learned decades ago that the universe would continue producing situations that required assessment regardless of whether he was ready for them. And many times, he asked. 3, over 4 hours, each one small, each one bringing us slightly starboard of Pakla's heading. She paused, organizing the information the way she'd learned he preferred it. Relevant facts first, interpretation second, uncertainty flagged clearly. The corrections are coming through the communications array. Something ahead is sending a signal the Arvith systems recognize as a navigational beacon. I don't know how. The signal isn't formatted like any Combine nav beacon I've seen, but the ship is treating it as one. Toward what? I don't know yet. The heading adjustment puts us on a slightly different approach vector into the cluster. But whether that's pointing us at something specific, I can't tell from here. Quintus looked at her for a long moment. The sodium orange light made shadows of the hollows under his eyes. None of them were sleeping well. None of them had slept well since the cells, if she was being honest. But Quintus carried his exhaustion the way he carried everything, as weight distributed evenly across both shoulders, acknowledged and managed and never complained about. Are we being warned off? He asked, the relevant military question. The first question a man with 30 years of frontier service would ask, because the answer determined everything that came next. If the corrections were pushing them away, they were entering contested territory and needed to decide whether to force the issue. If they were being pulled in, Deka shook her head. No, I think we're being checked. Awadnaid, Data en mycket stad sing till swinning. A warning pushes you away or puts something between you and the destination. An intercept vector, a weapons lock, a boundary marker. These corrections aren't pushing us away from the cluster. They're adjusting our approach to it, more precisely, towards something specific inside it. And the sensor anomalies I've been tracking for the past 3 hours aren't moving to block us. They're standing along our heading at intervals, watching us come. She hesitated, then added, in the field, when a community wanted to see you before they decided whether to shoot you or offer you tea, they sent someone to walk alongside the road you were coming in on. To look at you, that's what this feels like. Quintus absorbed this. He was good at that, taking information from a framework he didn't share and extracting the tactical content without needing the cultural context explained. Then we continue, he said, but I want you on that console until we arrive. Everything that happens, I want recorded. Already doing it. The ghost of approval crossed his face. On Quintus, that was practically a standing ovation. Good. The scan happened at 0804. Deka was back at her console, her propped panel now covered with 3 columns of annotations, presence readings, attention readings, and a new category she'd labeled architecture, readings that suggested structures in the spatial medium ahead that were not planets, not ships, not stations, but something else. Patterns in the background radiation that were too regular to be natural and too distributed to be constructed in any way she understood. She was writing Architecture 3, lattice pattern and ambient particle distribution consistent with shaped gravitational field, but without detectable mass source when her instruments stuttered. Every readout on her rebuilt console flickered simultaneously, a half-second dropout that washed the display clear and then brought it back, and when it came back, every reading was the same as before, except that something new was passing through the sensor field. It came from ahead, from the cluster. It washed through the Arvith like weather, like a warm front moving across a plain, felt before it was measured. Deka watched her instruments register it and try to classify it and fail. The scan, because that was what it was, she was certain of it by the second, was not electromagnetic. It was not gravitational. It was not any propagation medium in the Combine's physics database. The instruments measured its passage the way a seismograph measures a tremor. They could tell you something happened and how big it was and how long it lasted, but they could not tell you what it was. It was thorough. She watched it move through the ship on her sensor readout, layer by layer, hull first, then the space between the outer and inner walls, then the interior compartments. She could track its progress by the way her instruments responded to its passage. Each system it touched flickered in the same half-second dropout pattern, and then came back clean, as if it had been read and returned. It felt gentle. That was the wrong word, scientifically. Scans didn't have feelings. But Deka had been through Combine scans, the freight standard ones that the slaver ran during their captivity, calibrated to assess body mass and metabolic output and nothing else, as clinical and indifferent as a barcode reader. Those scans felt like being measured. This scan felt like being looked at by someone who understood the intrusion and was trying to do it carefully. She put her hand on the override. The scan passed through her console. She felt nothing. Her hands registered no vibration, no temperature change, no sensation at all. But every display on the console blinked and came back, and when it came back, her annotation panel was still propped against the wall, with all her handwritten notes intact, and the scan had not touched it, had passed around it, as if it recognized that the panel was her personal record and chose not to read it. She didn't engage the override. Her hand rested on the surface, and the scan continued, and she watched it sweep through the Arveth's bridge with patient thoroughness. 4 minutes, then it stopped. The instrument settled. Every readout returned to normal. The bridge was quiet, sodium orange, and humming exactly as it had been. Except, on the nav display, at the extreme edge of detection range, a new indicator had appeared. It was faint, almost below the display threshold. a marker that the Combine systems had tentatively classified as a surface settlement based on the density and thermal profile, even though the classification didn't fit the data any better than anything else had fit the data today. A planet in the cluster with something on its surface that was not a Combine outpost, not a natural formation, and not anything in the database. The corrected heading, the one the Arveth had been gently, carefully steered toward over the past 5 hours, pointed directly at it. Deka wrote 0808, scan complete, duration 4 minutes, medium unknown, behavior non-invasive, thorough, possibly selective, avoided personal annotation panel, coincidence or intent unknown, result, 1 new indicator on nav display, settlement, surface of a planet in the cluster. We have been steered toward it. We are spected, she called Quintus back. She told him about the scan. She told him about the new indicator. She told him about the heading and the way it pointed at the settlement like an arrow. Quintus asked, weapons profile? None. Intercept heading? None. Intercept heading? None. Nothing is moving toward us. Nothing has been moving toward us this entire time. Everything I've tracked has been stationary or nearly so, watching, not approaching. Could it be a trap? Draw us in, close behind it. Could be. I can't rule it out with the instruments I have. But the scan was Siadatis. She paused, looking for the right word. Careful. Whatever did that was trying not to alarm us. If you're setting a trap, you don't usually care whether the thing you're trapping feels comfortable. Quintus turned to look at the nav display. The settlement indicator glowed at the edge, faint and patient. Time to arrival? At current speed, about 7 hours. The orbital approach will take longer if we want to observe before committing. We want to observe. He was quiet for a moment. Then, wake Pakla. I want her reading whatever we can see of the surface from orbit before we get any closer. Tatada nodded and turned back to her console to record the order. That was when she heard the signal. It was in the background of the communications array, a frequency she had never seen used, buried below the standard channels the Combine reserved for operational traffic. It had been there for, she checked the log, 11 minutes. The array had been receiving it since the scan ended, and because it didn't match any Combine communication protocol, it had been routed to the passive monitoring buffer without flagging. Deka pulled it up. The signal was simple, repeating, a structured pattern too complex to be noise, too sparse to be a message in any language she recognized, a few syllables, repeated at regular intervals, with consistent frequency modulation, like someone saying the same word over and over calmly into a receiver they knew might not be listening. She gesso-oeded the audio and let it play through the bridge speaker. The sound filled the room. It was not mechanical. It didn't have the flat, processed quality of Combine transmissions. It sounded like a voice, not human, not alien, but something that made the hair on her arms stand up. A voice that spoke a single structured syllable, waited 3 seconds and spoke it again. Deka still parsing the frequency structure when she became aware that someone was standing in the bridge doorway. Aisha, the Romani woman, was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, head tilted slightly, eyes focused on something internal. She had been there. Deka checked the passive motion log on her console for 10 minutes. Since the signal started, she had come to the bridge, heard it, and simply stood in the doorway, listening. The signal repeated, that same structured syllable, patient and calm. The guarded neutrality she wore like armor shifted, and beneath it, for just a moment, Deka saw something she had only seen once before. The look Aihiji had when she first matched a Combine command word to an Ikran vocalization and realized the two languages shared a root. Recognition. Ambatish word, Ashur said. The signal repeated. The bridge hummed. Beyond the hull, the cluster waited, 40 stars the Combine had entered and never returned from, and one planet with something on its surface that was neither grown nor built, but somehow impossibly both. Deka looked back at her nav display. The settlement indicator pulsed at the edge of the screen, faint and steady, and the Arvith continued on the heading that something gentle and careful and very, very old had set for them. She began the orbital approach sequence. The planet resolved on the displays an hour later. Deka had seen alien worlds before. The Combine database was full of them. Thousands of catalog entries with standardized survey images rendered in the flat, clinical style the Combine used for everything. Gray surfaces under gray skies, or mineral plains under binary stars, each one photographed with the dispassion a warehouse clerk would bring to photographing a pallet of goods. Worlds as inventory items, surfaces as manifest entries. This was not that. The world that filled the Arvith's main display was green, not combined green, not the pale industrial tint that passed for vegetation in the few agricultural catalog entries Deka had found. Green the way Earth was green, deep and various and alive, forests and grasslands, and something that caught the light of the system's star and threw it back as a color she didn't have a name for. The atmosphere had clouds, real clouds, white and moving, casting shadows across a surface that looked an eye damp. She caught herself. It looked like home, not Somalia specifically, not any specific place she had ever been, but the light was right, the color temperature of the star, the angle of shadow, the way the clouds broke over the terrain. It looked like a world where a human body would know what to do with the air, where lungs designed for Earth's atmosphere and eyes calibrated to Earth's sun would feel, for the first time in weeks, like they were operating within parameters. Pakla was at the nav display. The Comanche woman had arrived 12 minutes after Deka sent the wake-up signal, dressed and sharp-eyed, and showing no sign of having been asleep, which Deka suspected meant she hadn't been. Pakla didn't waste words on greetings. She walked to the nav station, pulled up the surface imaging, and began to read. Deka watched her work. Pakla read terrain the way other people read text. Her eyes moved across the orbital imagery in sweeps, not focusing on details, but taking in patterns, relationships, the grammar of landscape. Where water collected, where wind shaped the growth patterns of vegetation, where the ground showed signs of use that weren't natural and weren't accidental. Pakla didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own language, and Deka had learned to read it. When Pakla was confused, she went still. When she saw something she recognized, her breathing changed, a fractional quickening that Deka wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't spent 2 weeks in close quarters with the woman. Pakla's breathing changed. She was looking at the settlement. It was visible now on the high-resolution surface scan, a cluster of structures near a river delta, in a valley sheltered by terrain that rose on 3 sides. The structures were small, organic-looking, built from local materials, wood, stone, something that might have been clay or fiber. They looked like they had grown there, like the valley had decided to produce buildings the way it produced trees, and the buildings had obliged by appearing in a pattern that was both irregular and clearly intentional. That was built, Deka thought, but it looks like it grew. Those are not the same thing. She looked at the settlement on the display and tried to understand what she was seeing. A village on an alien world in a cluster the Combine wouldn't enter. A signal repeating a word Aisha recognized. A scan that read their ship with the thoroughness of a doctor checking a child's heartbeat. Course corrections that steered them here like a hand on a tiller, patient and precise. Someone lived here, someone who knew they were coming, someone who had decided to let them arrive. The orbital approach indicators settled into green across her console. The Arvith systems were stable, the heading was true, and below them, in a valley, on a world that looked like it remembered what home was supposed to feel like, something was waiting. Deka began the descent calculations, and the light of a star that was not the sun, but could have been its sister, fell across her hands as she worked.